So it's fantastic to be here. I think these are unbelievably fascinating times to be involved in politics. If I was a spectator, I think this is the most exciting time ever. I'm not a spectator, and so I kind of find them fascinating, but mostly terrifying. But actually, at the end, I think there's a massive opportunity for people who are Liberals and Liberal Democrats. At the moment, all that you see in the papers, in terms of politics, is UKIP, UKIP, UKIP. I don't know what opinion poll ratings are on at the moment, sort of high teens, probably mid-teens. Take it back 3, 4, I think probably 4 weeks to the day actually, nearly not quite. So 3.5 weeks, all the talk was about Scottish independence. That mattered to me. I didn't realise quite how much it mattered to me until I got there, or until we got perhaps 2 weeks before polling day, and I went up there. And living in Cumbria, I'm only 45, 50 minutes drive from the border. And the penny dropped with me, this really could happen. Scotland could leave the United Kingdom. And lots of people use the phrase, Cameron used the phrase, it would break his heart. Actually, it generally would break my heart. As somebody who considers himself probably more British than I do English, perhaps it's because I'm a northerner, perhaps I don't know why. But in any event, the thought that Scotland would leave the UK, I found deeply personally upsetting. But nevertheless, you couldn't deny there was a great passion and a great attractiveness to the kind of Yes campaign. To some extent, I found it quite worrying, because there was a sense that you weren't really Scottish if you weren't Yes. And all these people with a shy nose, people who were going to vote no, wouldn't say so. There's a reason why they weren't saying no publicly, because they were scared, not necessarily of physical assault of any kind, but just generally being vilified. You were admitting that you weren't genuinely Scottish. And I think that's a load of nonsense. What I want to kind of put to you is that the SNP phenomenon and the Yes phenomenon, the 91% of people who turned out to vote in Joe Swinton's constituency, the 86% who turned out across Scotland, an absolute record since universal suffrage in the 1920s. There's never been a turnout even approaching it. And that wonderful kind of campaign, the terrifying campaign, so that kind of the nationalist separatist campaign from north of the border and UKIP, these are two parties that detest each other. The SNP, centre-left, broadly socialist, social democratic party, UKIP, who claim to be what the Tory party ought to be. And I want to tell you, or I want to put to you, these guys are exactly the same staple. And to be a nationalist, north or south of the border, is a phenomenon that has a kind of similar root, if you like. Now, and at the same time, there are other groups as well. I read stuff that Owen Jones puts out, and I see what the Green Party says, and a lot of the content of what those people say, and just indeed a lot of the content of what the SNP says, I sometimes think that's not far from what I think sometimes, but the solutions are just massively simplistic. And I think what frightens mainstream politicians now, this is why you had Ed Miliband, in forgetting half of his speech and forgetting the deficit and all that kind of thing. What he did remember was all these people he met in parks. I don't know if you remember his speech the other week. It's quite impressive to remember an entire 5-minute speech, even if you don't remember all of it. He talked about the people he met in parks and pubs, and he was trying to be authentic. I think that was the idea, and I don't dislike Ed Miliband, by the way. He was trying to be authentic, and Farron is seen to be authentic, and Cameron will try and do things that make him sort of slightly down with the kids who can seem to be authentic. And the thing is, mainstream politicians are terrified of the populist. They're terrified of the silver-tongued populist. And Farage, Salmond, and one or two others are people with a fag in one hand, a beer or a whiskey in the other, wrapped in a flag, Saltire or St George's or the Union Jack, and they've got really simple solutions, and they're easy to fall for. And our job is to provide something which meets that that fills that gap, because the gap is there for two reasons. One is globalisation. I don't want to get massively boring on you, but globalisation, in other words, the fact that there are few barriers to trade or to cultural barriers. One of the reasons why people get so excited and interested in the appalling state that is North Korea is it's the one place where 24-hour news doesn't work. And a guy turning up with a cane on a front page of a newspaper that you get a faxed copy of, that's news, because you can't do it all the time. Everywhere else, everything is constantly open. And globalisation is a good thing. Liberals should be in favour of it. Free movement of people, of ideas, of capital, that's a good thing. But the reality is, it also makes us really vulnerable. Governments used to be able to protect people. So if your pension disappears because of something that happened in a stock exchange on another continent, if you lose your job because wages are very low and are competitive in another country miles and miles and miles away, if those sort of things happen to you, you perhaps think globalisation doesn't work for you very much. And it might be a nice idea in theory, but in practice, it damages me, it damages my family. And the idea that politicians don't get it or they're out of touch, that's codswallop, because they always were. And the notion that politicians are more out of touch now than they were when they were mostly, the second son of dukes living in massive castles is nonsense. The MPs are out of touch, but no more than they were 40 years ago. The idea, really, the problem now, is that politics just doesn't deliver anymore, and we can't defend you. And I want to argue that's not true. We can do better than that. And the difficulty I find, you take what I say with a pinch of salt, particularly if you aren't a Liberal Democrat, and I am of course biased, but my great sense is that the other two parties, Labour and the Tories, there's a tension. Both of them have got their populist wings. Both of them want to give, there are people like the guys who've gone over to UKIP or attempted to go over to UKIP to get nice simple solutions. Our problems are foreigners, our problems is immigration, our problem is the European Union. And likewise you get equally simplistic solutions on the left. And the problem is that the opposite end, or the kind of challenging ideas to those ideas within the Labour Party and the Tory Party are not exciting either. In fact, they're just not exciting. And they're very managerial. And I like to think that when you stand for election to something, you stand to make a difference, not just to hold office, not just to wear a chain and feel good about yourself. You should be trying to make an actual difference. And so that I see against the backdrop of globalisation and governments not being able to protect people and managerialist boring parties that don't inspire anybody, and then a gap being filled by populists who frankly I think are dangerous. There's opportunity for us to be exciting and different and have something to say. And I kind of don't care that we're on 9% of the opinion polls. You may or may not have heard of William Beveridge. Maybe you have. Many of you have. I'm going to give you a two-minute lecture on William Beveridge if you've never heard of him. So William Beveridge was an MP for 1 year between 1944 and 45. He was a member of the last coalition government, the wartime coalition, where the Liberals formed the smallest part of it. He was then a member of a party, the Liberals, that had 12 seats, 2% in the polls, and so on. This man did more to change British politics and British society than probably anybody other than Margaret Thatcher since 1945. And what he did was, he identified what was called the 5 giant evils. I'm trying to remember them now. And they were want, ignorance, idleness, squalor, and disease. And they sound really kind of old-fashioned things, but just think about them. Want, ignorance, idleness, squalor, and disease. He didn't just identify them, he decided to do something about them. And he wrote a blueprint that would deal with want, idleness, squalor, ignorance, and disease. So and the answers were dead simple, or at least we would think they're simple now. They were revolutionary at the time. The answers were a national health service, a welfare state, council housing, free education, full employment. And these are things that have become part of the language and indeed of the landscape of Britain over the last, 60, 70 years. And they were partly dismantled after 1980, but only partly. And that man, I think what I love about Beveridge is that he just looked above what was possible and decided to do what was blooming necessary. And those evils needed tackling, and he came up with solutions. And the Labour Party got into power after 45, and they kind of just borrowed his blueprint. And so all of the good things that the Labour Party claimed they did after 45, yes, they did them, but it was a liberal blueprint. It's only like a boy band singing Lennon and McCartney lyrics, Yes, the boy band had the hit, but we all know that Lennon and McCartney wrote the words and the music. And so what I want to do now is say that this is a moment where we can be Beveridge for the 21st century. This is the moment we can set a new consensus. Because the reason why globalisation makes people feel terrified is because we're in an era of politics, and it has been the case for 30 or so years, where the general consensus is that government should just get out of the way. And I am somebody who believes in free markets, but that's not the same as government stepping back and saying, just get on with it. Because if a government steps back and says, just get on with it, poor people get poorer, and rich people get richer, and big companies get bigger, and small companies get crowded out of the market. And if you've ever heard of a guy called Adam Smith, great Scot, a great liberal, actually, in many respects, and he's often misquoted as being the evidence as to why the free market works. Well, he puts lots of qualifications over the free market, but what he talks about is that if you just government steps back and just lets things be, and doesn't intervene in the market, doesn't redistribute wealth, doesn't control excesses from the wealthy, doesn't help those who are least well off, then it doesn't matter, because there's an invisible hand in the marketplace. It'll make everything just even out. That's bollocks. It isn't true. Because actually, if there is a natural power in the marketplace, and it's called gravity. In other words, the bigger something is, the more stuff accretes to it. And the smaller something is, the more likely it is to get sucked into the bigger thing. And so what I want is the Liberal Democrats to say, look, the answer to the fact that Britain is in a difficult place at the moment, recovering from a recession, potentially possibly we've gone into depression, a lack of certainty, an attractiveness of populists with easy answers. What I want to do is provide some genuine hope. I don't want to be managerialist and just say, just give us power and we'll manage it quite competently. That's not going to inspire anybody. What I want to be able to say is, right, here is a mission, a blueprint of a Britain that's going to be better. So here we are. This is what I think we should be doing. You might know, okay, so Britain is trying to escape from an appalling deficit situation. But there are two kinds of government spending. There's revenue spending and there's capital spending. And to kind of make it sort of straightforward, many of you will get this anyway. If you own a newsagent and you are borrowing money to pay your till staff, that is stupid, because you're going to go bust. However, if you borrow money to buy the empty shop next door so you can sell more stuff, that's quite clever. That's capital spending. So the first is revenue, the second is capital. And my take is we are going to have to be quite tight still on spending over the next 5 or 6 years, maybe a bit more. But what we can do is borrow to invest. So HS2 is just, it's the first thing. The idea that HS2 is the answer to everything is nonsense, but it is an answer, because the alternative is building loads more railways, loads more motorways, sorry. And we should be building east-west things. I mean, I got down here now, it's not bad from London, but most east-west connections are ludicrous in this country. You've got the average broadband speed in this country, half the speed of the country that we just narrowly beat on Saturday night, Estonia. And you think South Korea, you mentioned North South Korea, will have a gigabit per second average download speed in 2 years' time. Now, if you think that the UK is 17 megabits per second, gigabits, that's 1,000 megabits per second in just 2 years' time. And they won't be nationalising it. They won't do that way. They're going to create what's called a universal service obligation. They will say to their equivalent of BT, you can have access, but only if you provide a gigabit per second. And if you don't want to provide that, clear off and provide somebody else's, and we'll have another provider. And I want that kind of ambitious government that decides we're going to create a new economy based on the same kind of spirit the Victorians had. It's about building infrastructure and communications, but I also want us to be tackling what is comfortably the humankind's biggest challenge, and that is climate change. And you might have heard, Cameron special advisors talking the other week or the other month actually about green crap, which are the green taxes and funds going into renewable energy. And I don't buy that. The reality is that climate change is not some esoteric concern that just bothers Guardian readers. It's something for everybody. Because if the temperatures change as the UN predicts they will, we are looking at, in this century, certainly by the time the children born today reach 80, we could be seeing global temperatures up by at least 2 degrees and possibly 7. That is catastrophic. That is not just some hippie concern. That means hundreds of millions of people displaced. It means, biblical style kind of displacement of people. It means the desiccation or deluge of farmland. It means, and what's the number one thing people fight over, go to war over? Land. And the second most, clean, fresh water. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about. So not tackling climate change is bloody stupid. And the notion that 97% of the world's scientists are somehow engaged in a conspiracy to kind of hoodwink us into the fact that climate change is ludicrous. So tackling that is absolutely massive. And we've got to look at how we do it in a way which actually rebuilds Britain and creates a kind of energy, a national mission. And that means, for example, we've got to build that barrage over the Severn Estuary. There are reasons not to do it, but there are just much better reasons to do it. You've got 4 nuclear power stations worth of energy. just across that estuary there. My neck of the woods in Cumbria, Lancashire, we have Morecambe Bay. You can create probably 1.5 nuclear power stations worth of energy by building one there. And the great thing about building hydro technology schemes is that 95% of the supply chain is British. You're not giving money to Chinese or French business people, you're reinvesting the money in this country. And we also need, I mean, without going into vast amounts of detail, you will soon find out, if you haven't already, that the housing market is broken quite badly. And when I was your age, you know, an average salary bought a reasonable house. And today, I'm sorry, you're going to be snookered in a few years' time. And it is not fair. The fact that the average house price in this country is something like 8 times the average wage, and you think that you shouldn't really be lent any money for a mortgage unless any more than 3.5 times the average wage. You know, we need to build, you know, something like 3 million new homes over the next 10 years, and they've got to be mostly affordable. And so that's not going to happen by the market. It means government's making these things happen. And so I want government that is active and ambitious and will decide to do things, not just sit back and wash its hands. And those things I've talked about, which are just, you know, a quick run through of some of the things that we should be doing, that is how you could build a sense of national mission. Because I'm a sucker for hope. You know, the whole, you know, there were bits of the Salmond campaign that I found hugely attractive. You know, you know, in the same way that I found the Obama campaigns, particularly in 08, but in 12 as well, just hugely moving. The idea of lifting people's eyes to something better. And so I can see why Salmond was nearly successful, because hope is a good thing. But there's only one thing worse than no hope, and that is hope disappointed and unfulfilled. And that's why I'm talking about a hope which is based upon, as I say, a sense of national mission, of rebuilding. Because the one thing that Farage and Salmond really have in common is the sense that they seek to blame our ills or their ills on others. You know, we're in the state we're in because of Europe, because of the English, because of foreigners, because of immigrants. You name it, there's somebody else to blame. And if I want to get really heavy tonight for your bedtime reading, you might want to Google an essay called The Trouble with X by C.S. Lewis. The notion being that we always have, always somebody else is to blame for our problems. Generally speaking, the answer and the solution to our problems is in here, it's with us. And I think if we do those things, we can genuinely make a difference. And for what it's worth, I've seen inside the head of Nigel Farage. And it's an interesting place, because when Nick Clegg did the debates with Farage back in May, wasn't it? April, May. We did do a bit of practicing beforehand, and I was Farage, and it was great fun. We stood in the Ministry of Sound, because the Ministry of Sound is owned by the Liberal Democrat. Ministry of Sound in sort of Bermondsey around Elephant and Castle, and we practiced. I even wore a purple tie. And it was really interesting, because I kind of came away, people were saying, oh, you did a good job, well done on doing that research. I thought, well, you shouldn't thank me, because it was just the easiest thing I've ever done in my life. All you have to do, and by the way, I don't dislike Farage, met him a couple of times, affable guy. All you have to do to be Farage is to think of the easiest, laziest, most populist thing you could possibly say, make up some statistics, and then say it. And that's it. And that is an easy thing to do. But for us, as Liberal Democrats, having spent 70 years in opposition, we did the only thing we could have done 4.5 years ago, and that was to go into government. And you know, there was the alternative of just sitting on our hands and achieving nothing. Instead, we decided that we were going to take the opportunity given to us. And you know, I would say that, you know, we've not let people down. I think there's some things I wish we'd done differently, but we've not let people down. What we have done between us is left that gap in the market. And that gap in the market is being filled by people whose answers are either just wrong or, even worse than that, dangerous. And if we don't fill that gap, they'll get filled by people who are either boring or dangerous. Let's be neither of those things. Any questions?